Welcome to this presentation, Being Welcoming. I'm Rev Mat Harry. I'm based in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, and I'm really excited because if you stick with this presentation, you're going to learn insights that, if implemented into your Christian community, will assist your church to tap into the potential that new people present. To say that there is a huge need for support, acceptance, and reassurance within the community, given our current circumstances, is an absolute understatement, particularly with so much uncertainty in the world at the moment. Christian community ought to fill some of this need. Yesterday, I had an email from Jenny Campbell at Glen Iris Road Uniting Church, and she said this: our services are currently on Zoom and have been throughout Melbourne's many weeks of lockdown. And I suspect that there will be many more into the future too. We have found that we have had more visitors since being on Zoom, as some churches are not doing interactive services. In our periods of face-to-face meetings, we have also had new people and visitors, as other churches have not been able to get going again under the restrictions. Visitors present an opportunity for new community, particularly if they are only visitors the first time they come. Ideally, they should develop a sense of belonging very quickly and feel a sense of being supported, accepted, and reassured. Now, most of the research which John will present tonight comes from established churches. However, no matter the way you gather as Christian community, if you are doing a fresh expression or an emerging church, there are principles that are totally transferable into different forms of Christian community. So as John presents, I encourage you to listen for the principles, regardless of how it is that you gather. He will cover some of the best practice aspects of being a welcoming church. John will reveal, from an evidence-based approach, when a visitor decides whether a Christian community is friendly or not, who should welcome newcomers, why first-time visitors choose not to return, how to welcome so that people have a sense of belonging. These are easily implementable insights that can assist your Christian community to include newcomers so that they feel a sense of belonging. So I'd like to introduce John. He's been my supervisor for the last 18 months or so. He brings a unique and fascinating blend of Christian leadership experience as the long-term CEO of Christian Blind Mission. He combines this with extensive experience in governance from serving on boards of several Australian and international NGOs, working in disability, medical research, and community housing. And because of his services to the community, John in 2014 was awarded the Order of Australia Medal. So let's hand over now to John.
Thanks, Matt, for that welcome, and it's great to be with you. And I'm excited to be sharing with you some interesting research that's been done on how we as a church around Australia, Christian communities, can be more welcoming to people who visit our churches and Christian communities. And I suspect some of what I'll share with you, many people will say, well, that was rather obvious, John. I could have told you that. And that's probably true. There'll be other things that I'll share with you where you may go, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. That's interesting. I need to think harder about that. And there may be one or two things which I share with you where you'll go, oh, that, to say the least, is counterintuitive. It wasn't what I was expecting, and I need to think hard about that. And that's worthwhile doing. So what we've done with the team at Partners in Ministry, we've done a whole lot of research on church growth and why people get engaged with the church. And maybe now is a good time to have a think back yourself. What was it like the first time you visited the church that you're at now? What was your experiences like? All we've done is gone to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, McCrindle Research, the National Church Life Survey, and basically we've also read every book that's ever been written on church growth and come to some very interesting conclusions. It's my pleasure to go through with you. And why did we focus on welcoming and integration? Basically because Jesus says it's a good idea. He says it's a good idea to welcome people to come and be near to you. Now, I've put a slide up here that's a graph, and I can imagine many people have gone, oh no, he's got graphs. And a few of you have gone, oh, wonderful, he's got graphs. Look, if you're not a graphs person, don't worry, I don't have too many graphs. But I do want to explain this graph to you. What we're looking at here is we're assuming for a church that averages on a Sunday, their weekly service, they have 100 people at the service. So if your church is half that size, just halve these figures. If your church is twice that size, double them. What we see that for a church that has 100 people coming on a Sunday, if you look at those people gathered, you'll find about 80 of them are there every week. And then you have about another 40 people who tend to show up around once a month. And then you have an interesting group of people. You have about 160 people who will make a first-time visit to your church. And then you have another 280 people that are basically your C and E's. They're your Christmas and Easters. They might come once or twice a year. But what we want to do today is focus on the middle group there, the first-time visitors to your church.
That seems like an awfully lot of people.
Yeah, it is a surprising number of people that cross the threshold of every church each year.
So that is 1.5 times the amount of people who are actually worshipping there.
Yes, and when I saw these figures for the first time, I said to myself, I'm not so sure. And then I watched in my own church, worked the figures out for my own church. And within about a month, I said to myself, golly gumbits, this is actually correct. So for a church of 100 people, you'll have 160 people come over the course of the year for the first time, roughly 3 a week. And what you'll find is of that 160 people, a bit over half of them are well-churched people. They know what a church is on about. They understand the customs. They understand the language. In some cases, they understand the clothing that people wear. But for just under half the people who come for the first time, they are all at sea. They're really confused. They're not sure how to act. They're nervous. And we really need to have an understanding of how those two different groups of people will react as they engage with the church. So we asked people, as a newcomer, what was your first visit? And what we found was that for most people, their first visit to a church is to an ordinary worship service. You might think that people's first visit is Christmas and Easter, or for some other activity like a baptism or wedding. Actually, for most visitors, their first time visit to your church is to an ordinary worship service. And what this means is if you have an A-grade game you use for welcoming people, you need to be playing the A-grade game every week, because that's when most people engage with you first, their first visit to a church. And surprisingly, the month of the year you're most likely to get the most visitors is January. And for many churches, their welcoming team, January is the month they have off. But that is the month of the year you will likely get most visitors.
Is that because people are on holidays or they have more spare time, those sorts of things?
Yeah, that too. Plus, it's also to do with actually people changing jobs. Many people will change jobs at the end of the year and move to a new city. They'll move to a new suburb, and now they're looking for a new church. So right. January is when you need to be playing the A-grade game, but you actually need to play the A-grade game every week.
And for a lot of churches, the ministerial leadership takes holidays on the January. I used to. January was always my month off.
Yep. Sorry to be telling you the bad news, Matt, but that's what it actually is. And we asked people too why it was they left their previous congregation. So have a think about it. What do you reckon the reason is that most people leave their congregation? There's actually one reason that accounts for 70% of people leaving your congregation. And that is simply they've moved to a new area. You may think the most common reason people leave might be bad preaching or unfriendly people. I'm not saying that's not unimportant, but the key reason that most people leave your church is because they've moved to a new area. So what this means is the key reason why you lose people from your church, you probably can't do much about it. So you can be sensitive to, you can't actually do much about that. A certain number of people will leave your church each year because they're moving, but it does cause you to raise the question, well, if a lot of people are moving out of our area, that means others are moving into our area. And it will raise the question for you, so what are you doing about new people that have come to your area? So apart from moving, what do you think the next key reason is that attenders will leave a church? And here, this may surprise you. This is research that was done on 2 large churches in Melbourne. And what they found is that for 90% of those who left the church other than for moving, the only connection these leavers had to the church was the Sunday service. So if you wanted to be prophetic and try and guess who of your current congregation is most likely to leave your church, it's people whose only connection to the church is the Sunday service. What this is basically telling you is if you have multiplicity of connection points between new people and the people of the church, they are much more likely to engage with the church, harmonize with the church, and become an active member of the church.
The greater participation in different things. Absolutely, that makes sense. Perfect sense.
Yeah, when you think about it, it does, but you probably never thought about it in those terms.
Yeah.
So basically, for a church with 100 people coming every week, you will have about 160 visitors coming each year. And most of them are coming to your ordinary services. So we might want to think about how is it that we go about improving our welcoming and our connecting of these visitors into our church community.
We need to get them to feel as though they belong. They need to have this sense of belonging. I mean, this is part of the thing that you had before in terms of participation. If they're coming along to the Sunday or the worship service, whichever day of the week it happens, but if they're coming along to worship, but there's no other connection point, then yeah, we need to give them a greater sense of belonging to that community.
Yes, and so what we're wanting you is to do is be intentional about it, to actually think through what is the welcome pathway someone would go if they go from being a visitor to your church to actually becoming a regular member of your church. So we want you to have an intentional pathway to think it through. We also want you to do it in an authentic way. And we also want you to lift your expectation of what you could actually achieve by making a few small changes. So we want you to be intentional. One pastor said to us, visitors join this church despite us. Only the keen ones jump through all the hoops. So we want you to really think through a logical pathway for people joining your church. We want you to make it easy for visitors to connect well at your church. We want you to be intentional about that. So what are the welcome team keys that you need to think about? We want you to map out a simple pathway from a new person first time visiting you until they're becoming a regular member of your church? What's the pathway? So the first question I want you to think about is, when do you think the pathway starts? When do you think the welcoming process starts with your church? And what I find with most people I ask this question to, they'll say something like when they pull up in the car park, or when they enter the door, or when they meet the greeter. They'll say, that's when we think the pathway starts. I want to challenge you on that. The latest data tells us that for all the new people that visit your church, 90% have already been to your website. So you need to think about your website as a key tool in welcoming people to your church. And you need to think in terms of your website being actually there to serve new people rather than the normal members of your congregation. What does the opening page of your church website look like?
It's one of the things that's really interesting, I think, John, that when you go onto when you go onto church's website, quite often it's like a store of information for those people who are actually a part of the community. It's not about a kind of an entry point and an advertisement of this is who we are and this is what you can expect.
Exactly, Matt, you're right on to this. So you'll see with some churches' websites, and I've looked at a lot, many of them, the opening page will have some curious explanation of their particular brand of theology, which is not actually what most people are looking for. So the most visited page on a church's website is a page that's called something like Meet the Team or About the Pastor. That's what most people click through to. And what they're doing is trying to get some idea of what it would feel like if I went to visit this church. What are the type of people that I'm going to meet? And they're not so interested in the number of theological degrees your pastor or minister may have. They want to understand more about the pastor or minister as a person. What football team does he support? That's big in Melbourne to know that. What's his coffee order? That's big in Melbourne. Is he a family person? Is she someone who has a particular hobby in some area? People are wanting to understand what it's going to be like if I go to that church. Who are the types of people I'm going to meet? So we want you to map out a welcome pathway that starts with, what would someone put into Google if they were wanting to come to your church? So here's an interesting thing for you. Go to Google and put the name of your suburb or town and the word church, because that's what most people will put in your area. And have a look at where your church comes up in the Google listing. And you might want to engage some of the younger tech savvy people who can actually suggest things to you with your website of how it will come up higher in the listing with some clever things that they can do. But start thinking of a visitor. The first thing they're going to put into Google is your town or suburb name and church. They're going to look at your website and then they're going to decide whether they want to visit you. We want you to raise and train a welcome leader, even a team, to think this through so that we don't want anyone to fall through the cracks. We want to engage well with people who often for the first time are engaging with faith. Their first visit to the church is something they're very nervous about. We want to look after them very well. So we want you to have a clear purpose, not just think of yourself as merely greeters. And we want you to share stories of how well you've done the welcoming process. So when does a visitor decide whether a church is friendly or not? So have a think about those who come to your church, the first time visitors to your church. When do you think it is that they decide whether your church is friendly or not? I've done some research in this, and what we've found is that most people think, or will answer, it's probably the warmth of the welcome as they walk into the door, how they're greeted when they walk into the door. They're very nervous, how they're greeted. What the researchers found was that's not the key time. The key time, the researcher sums it up by this way: it wasn't the 10 minutes I expected. I thought they would say it was right after they got out of the car and walked into the building. But more than any other time, folk said, I decided this was a friendly church in the 10 minutes following the conclusion of the service. And when I first read that, I thought to myself, that's interesting, because at my church, we have a welcome team and they knock off after the first song or hymn has been sung. When in actual fact, the most important part of welcoming on a Sunday morning is what happens at the end of the service. And as you're thinking about this, maybe you're thinking, yeah, I know what it's like to be lonely in a crowd. To have the service conclude, all the in people talk to each other, and I'm left there like a shag on a rock with no one talking to me.
We can, sadly, John, we can all relate to that. We've all been on holiday somewhere, or, we've always been checked out a different church when we've moved to a new place. And, everybody moves into their little huddles after the service finishes, and you're just left kind of standing there. And yeah.
So when you're thinking about your welcome team, we encourage people to think of your warm, friendly people who may greet people as they arrive. That's not unimportant. But there's a group of people you may think of that we call pew missionaries. And these are the good, solid citizens of your church who have a warm, engaging, outgoing personality, who are actually throughout the service monitoring who's there, seeing there's new people, and actually having the courage to go up to them afterwards and engage with new people. Really important that you engage with new people at the last 10 minutes or at the end of the service. And there you need to also be thinking, remember I showed you that just over half the people who attend are well-churched and understand the funny mannerisms that we have. And just under half are really all at sea. Well, you need to have two different strategies of how you're going to talk to those people. If it's a well-churched person, they've just moved into the area, they're looking for a church, you might be thinking, I need to invite them to one of the small groups we run. Well, I need to engage them in some social functions that they're running. If they're a person who this is the first time they've actually engaged with faith or church, and more that's common in Australia, you need to be thinking of how are you going to engage them in the story of Jesus? What are the programs that your church offers that present the gospel to people? Can you engage them in an Alpha program or a Christianity Explained program? Or who in your church is going to be good to meet with them, to connect them into the church in a way that's tailor-made for them? So you need to be doing a bit of triage in understanding how you're going to treat different people who come to your church. So there's some key moments you need to think about in your connection pathway. You do need to think about the 10 minutes before the service, but you need to think in terms of the 10 minutes before the service. It's mainly a job of ushering. It's saying, welcome to our church, come and sit in a seat. Visitors usually don't want to sit down the front, they want to sit at the back. You may give them some explanation of who's who in the zoo, this person's the minister, etc. You may want to give them any warning about anything that is unusual that's going to happen in the service. Are you having communion that day or not? You may want to just fill them in a little bit about that. You need to think about a greeting time during the service, and I'll talk a bit about that soon. You need to think about what happens at the end of the service. That's critical. Now, you also need to think of what's going to happen in the first 36 hours after the service. And what are your clear next steps after the church service to engage a new person? What do you actually want the new person to do? Do you want them to engage in a small group? Do you want them to go to some meet with someone one-to-one, match them with someone? Do you want them to have some sort of evangelism course? What are your clear next steps?
The 36
Now,
hours after is really interesting. And I know that we'll get to that, but that's really interesting to think about in terms of 36 hours afterwards.
yes, so what I'm trying to do now is to help put you in the mind of a first-time visitor to your church. I know of one church that decided what we're going to do is take our welcome greeting people, and we're actually going to take them down to the TAB and see how they feel at the TAB, because we're going to take them into a situation where they probably feel a bit uncomfortable, just to give them the idea of what it's like to be uncomfortable, because that's how uncomfortable a lot of the first-time visitors to your church feel. So what we've done some research where we've looked at what happens when a volunteer makes contact with a first-time visitor within 36 hours of them visiting your church, basically if they get back to them the next day. And we find that 85% of them will return to worship the next Sunday. Now,
So the 36 hours is interesting, because basically that means that you have to have somebody who makes contact with them before they go to bed on Monday night.
yeah,
That's
basically,
36 hours.
Yeah. So if you're giving a warm greeting, you need to back it up with some action straight after.
By Monday night.
Yeah. And what the research has shown that if you delay that, only 60% will return. And if you delay it 5 to 7 days, not many will return. Now here, take a deep breath. Here's a reality check for you. If it's the pastor or minister who makes the first contact, you can halve those percentages.
Wow. So here we go. We can put this into perspective, right? So you've got a first-time visitor to your congregation, to your Christian community, and you've got a lay person who makes them feel welcome in the first 10 minutes after the worship service. And then they've got some sort of pathway where they connect with them, maybe invite them out for a coffee or whatever. If they make contact within 36 hours before they go to bed, if it's a Sunday morning service, before they go to bed on the Monday night, 85% will return the next Sunday. That is extraordinary. But if it's the minister, less than half of them will come back.
Right. So we need to think this through, because there's some logic into it when you think about it. We're not saying the pastor's not very good at this. This is not a slap, not a slapper on the face of the pastor or the minister. What it's actually showing you is the power of lay people, the power of volunteers. Because you think about it, when a volunteer goes to the effort of following up straight away and basically says, I love this church so much that I want you to come and be part of it. Wow, that is a powerful message.
So is that almost like a testimonial for the church? And the testimonial for the church, testimonial for the church comes from the lay people, not the person who is part of their vocation.
Yep. And maybe you found this when you yourself have visited churches. When you visit a church, often at the end of the church, the pastor or the minister will come and talk to you. And you'll be feeling within yourself, this is very nice. I appreciate them making me feel welcome. I really appreciate them talking to me. But somewhere in the back of your head, you may be saying, but they're paid to do this. This is their job. So if it's a volunteer who does the follow-up, you are much more likely to get visitors who will stick to your church.
Twice as likely, according to that research that you've just presented.
That's exactly right. So when we're thinking of the welcome pathway now, we're starting with Google. We're going to people coming through the door and being ushered in. We're talking about What happens in the 10 minutes after the service ends, critical. And then what follow up and how quickly are you going to follow up that person afterwards?
There's something about belonging here, because people won't invest in a group that they feel like they can't belong in. And I wonder whether this research just supports that whole idea, because people will feel like they can belong if there is somebody who is an intimate part of that group, who is making a good, decent effort to be welcoming, but quickly as well.
Yeah. And so it goes back to the multiplicity of contact points throughout the week. When people are engaged, we've looked at, if you invite me to your church, Matt, at what point will I stop describing me as going to Matt's church? What will be the trigger that starts to say, I'm going to my church rather than Matt's church? And that turns on me having contact points other than you. So whilst ever you're the only person I know in the church, I'm at Matt's church. Once I have multiplicity of contact points, I start saying this is my church. And we talk about people.
You need to start going out for coffee with people other than just me.
Well, we need you to think about yourself as a Lego brick. And with a Lego brick, it has the ability to join to other Lego bricks, but it only has a finite ability to join to other Lego bricks. And if you're like that, the people in your church are like that all their contact points are full and they have no room for new people, that's going to be an issue for you. Another church I did this seminar at, when we talked about this, they said, this is really interesting, because what we find is when we want to meet up with each other to discuss whatever church business or whatever, we usually say to ourselves, well, I'll meet you after church. I'll meet you at the end of church. And they actually brought in a guideline. And their guideline was this, that once the service ended, no one was talk to their friends until they could see every visitor had someone talking to them. So they actually bought the guideline rules probably a bit strong, but they realized this is important. If we're just going to meet with each other, we have no room for new contact points, visitors are going to feel a little lonely. We also want you to be authentic. So think about it. Whose responsibility do you think it is to welcome newcomers to your church? Hopefully we all get that answer right. It's everybody. When we ask people, how important is it that your church is friendly to visitors? This is not surprising. 92% of people say it's really important that the church is friendly to visitors. We ask people, what were the reasons they drop out of church? 45% will say, I actually didn't feel part of the church. I didn't feel I belong. And a quarter of people actually use the word clique or in group. So we're wanting you to not be cliques or in groups. We're wanting you to be the Lego brick that has a space to attach to new people.
Which of course is about the pathway, goes back to the pathway about being easy rather than difficult to actually belong to.
Yeah.
If there's no Lego pieces there for you to stick to, there's no relationships, you can't stick.
Yep. So if you're wonderfully warm and welcoming with people the first week, that's great. If the visitor returns the next week and all your people are busy welcoming the other new people and no one's got actually any time for the person coming back, that's a problem. Why do first-time visitors choose not to return to the church they visited? Hang on to your hats. This was from top 10 ways churches drive away first-time guests. The number one thing mentioned, having to stand up and greet one another having a stand up and greet one another time in the worship service. And usually when I'm presenting this face to face with people, I can tell by the looks on people's faces, I've just divided the room. What happens is all the extroverts in the room say, what sort of black magic is this he's peddling? But at the same time, all the introverts in the room are going, yeah, I hate that. So if your way of conducting a worship service has in it some sort of point where visitors have to stand up and greet other people, you need to think about that, because a good number of people do not like that at all, and they will choose not to return. You really need to think about any sort of greeting time that makes it really awkward for people who are not as outgoing as maybe you are. It's a really awkward problem. The second reason is probably much more what you would expect. Unfriendly church members. And I'm not going to show you all 10, but I am going to show you number 9. Members telling guests that they were in their seat or pew. And when I do this live, normally someone there will say, oh, yes, I've actually experienced that. You may think it doesn't go on, it still goes on. You need to be thinking of how your church community can be warm and engaging and welcoming for people.
One of the things that's really interesting, just to pick up the point around what are the things that turn people off, is in quite a few of the churches I've been involved in, they have this thing where they welcome visitors. I actually think the word visitor is missing the point entirely, because you're already labeling that person. Because it's their first time, you're labeling them as a visitor. The assumption is they won't come back. Well, if you're going to label them as a visitor, they're not going to come back.
Yep. I've been at churches, the same thing, where they ask all the visitors to stand up. Now, I'm an extrovert. I'll talk to anyone. Doesn't worry me at all. My wife is an introverted person. She hates it. It really feels very awkward. So I've got to go, just because I feel it's okay doesn't mean that everybody does. It's actually a huge stumbling block for a lot of people, that they have to stand up and identify themselves as someone who's different because they're visiting. I did a presentation at one church, and they realized what they did was it was a church of about 300 people, and they had a particular area on the side of the auditorium, and they had this huge sign that said visitors lounge and a big arrow pointing down to it. And what they were wanting to do was they were wanting first time visitors after the service to go and stand under the sign so that they could all identify who the new visitors were and welcome them. Their motive was good, but I said to them, think about it, who here would like to go and stand under the sign? And they said, yeah, we need to pull that down. We asked people, how were you successfully made to feel welcome? And here, this backs up the previous things I was showing you. For 48% of people, it was an attender spoke to me. And look at that. It's almost double the number who said the minister spoke to me. Here again, we're seeing the power of the lay people, the volunteers. If you are the ones saying, I love this church so much that I want you to be part of it, that's incredibly powerful, that an attender speaks to the visitors. This one here shows you, it actually shows you how people behave when they've feel they've had a lot of spiritual growth in the church that they're at. So people who feel they've grown spiritually in a church are 54% likely to have invited someone non-churched in the last year. That's the red column. People who say, I've had no real spiritual growth in this church, are half as likely to invite someone non-church. And then you can see the same percentages for those that give tithe 10%, and for those who say they feel at ease talking about their faith. When people are growing in their faith, they're much more likely to invite non-church people to your church. So we want you to be authentic in the way you welcome people. We want you to go the extra mile to connect. We want you to shift your mindset. Learn what the next steps are in this connection process yourself. And think about, how can you connect visitors with multiple members after the service? Are you going to ask them to join you afterwards for a hot drink or lunch? Introduce them to the pastors or leaders. Follow them up yourself. Have the attitude every church member here is a host, not a guest.
I love that. I love that expression, because I think that if you can pick up some of these principles and put them into short, pithy little statements, almost like memes, people then will remember those, and they can become part of the culture because everybody remembers them, so they can hold other people to account for their behavior around that thing. So, every church member here is a host, not a guest.
Yeah.
I mean,
yep.
What potential there is if you actually pick that up as a short phrase that you talk about, or you self-describe your Christian community as, that everybody here is a host, not a guest. That has huge potential.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Matt. I know of one mid-sized church here in Melbourne that if you go as a first-time visitor, the way you'll be greeted is they'll say to you, Matt, what sort of coffee do you like? And you say skinny decaf latte or whatever your order is.
That is my order. How did you know that, John? Do I look like a skinny decaf latte guy, do I?
Yeah, you look like a guy that if we gave you too much caffeinated coffee, you could be running marathons. No, what they ask you your coffee order before the service starts, and as soon as the service ends, you're presented with that coffee. How good is that? Do you think that person's going to walk out the door and leave? They're presenting them with the coffee.
Do you know what that? Do you know what that says though? That says we care enough about your personal preferences that we will make it to your liking.
Yep. And it also says we're prepared to have a coffee with you. Yeah.
When I got baptized I was an adult when I got baptized, and I was really quite astounded. To be honest with you, I was surprised with myself that there was a lady within the congregation who had cut out of felt my name, my first name and my second name, Matthew James, and she'd put it up on the baptismal banner.
Wow.
And I thought it actually means something to her that it's me who's getting baptized and she's willing to go to this effort. I was just really, really touched by that.
Wow.
And it's those sort of things that people actually remember. They may not talk much about it, but that's the sort of thing that people remember.
Yeah. And this is people personally engaging with you.
Yeah.
We want you to lift your expectation as what could be achieved. One person said to us, I don't expect newcomers to stay. When visitors turn up for the first time to our church, I'm almost trying to find them another church to go to. A genuine quote. I hope it's not from someone's listing church, but that is actually the way some people will react. We really want you to be warm and embracing of new people.
Yeah.
We want you to pray. Jesus said, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Pray to the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest field. It's one of my last graphs, you'll be pleased to know. I wonder if you're thinking that I hear stuff on the media all the time about what people think about the church, and most of Australians aren't interested in attending church or engaging with faith. It's true of some people, but not as many as you would think. This shows you when surveyed the Australian population, when asked how likely would you be of becoming a frequent member of the local church? Just over half say, no, I'm not going to. But look at the top answers there. 3% say very likely, and some 9% say it's somewhat likely. That means that 1 in 8 people are actually, if you ask them, actually likely to accept an invitation to come to your church. Another 14% say unsure, but that leaves you with still 1 in 4 people are likely to think about, will seriously consider an invitation to attend your church if you ask them.
Of course, the thing about that is that the 52% who are very unlikely, I mean, if you had have asked me before I became a Christian, I was the 52%, right? I was in that red stronger than anybody else.
Yeah, and as I've got to know you, Matt, I can guess you might have told me quite vociferously what you thought. And that's true. We're not trying to say that's not true. What we are saying is the general person in the street, in your suburb or town, is probably more likely to accept an invitation to church than you might think, or that the media might tell you. It's 1 in 4 people will actually give it serious consideration. So visitors are coming to your church, and they're coming to your normal Sunday service. We want you to be intentional. We want you to review what welcome method you have and say to yourself, how can you improve it? Do you need a team? Do you need a system? Do you need some measurements? And we want you to be authentic. We want the welcome to be authentic as to what they're going to experience at your church. And we want you to just lift your expectation a little bit and say, maybe we can be surprised here as to how well we may be able to do in this area. So I want to end with one last story of an estate agent. And this was an estate agent in Australia recently who decided that he wanted to explore issues of faith, and he'd never been to a church before. So he went to the local church and he left his details. And on the Thursday afterwards, so 5 days later, the pastor followed him up and engaged with him. The estate agent said, I don't get it. He said, in my world, I look for hot prospects. And if I identify someone as a hot prospect, I follow them up on the same day or the day after. And if any of my staff waited 5 days to follow up a hot prospect, I'd sack them. How much more do we want people to engage with our church? So we want to be doing whatever we can to make our welcome authentic, intentional, so that a great chance that people will want to, for the first time, for many people, they're going to engage with Jesus. This is really significant work that we're doing. And so we're asking you to think about some small changes that you could make at your church that could radically lift the response from people. So what you may want to think about, list the things that you reckon your Christian community or church is doing well. I reckon you're probably doing a lot of these things intuitively. I reckon you're doing some of them really well. But what are the things that you could improve? And I've suggested and shown you a couple of ones you probably weren't expecting, such as your website. You didn't think I'd talk about your website, but I have. And is there anything you actually need to stop doing as a way forward? So that's the key part of our presentation, Matt. I hope it's really helpful for people.
Yeah, look, I'm sure it's really helpful. You're going to hear my confession now, John. And my confession is that I made all of those mistakes whilst I was in congregational ministry. Probably less so but probably far less so, to be honest with you, with the Fresh Expressions communities that I've been a part of. But certainly there was kind of an expectation with the Sunday morning community that it was being too forward if we were asking for people's details, their telephone number and their name and so forth. And we were definitely being way too pushy if we got in contact with them within 36 hours. Like, that's just way too pushy. So in terms of raising the expectations, that was definitely, those sort of assumptions were a roadblock to us actually making sure that people would find some Lego spaces in the relationships within our community, because it was a little bit like, oh, you don't want to put too much pressure on people. But people are coming in and they're exploring your community. You should actually be putting your best foot forward and saying, doing all of those things that you can potentially do to just be loving, welcoming, and considerate of others.
Yeah.
So look, I think about it, and I think about all of those missed opportunities. Yeah. And I just wish I had have heard this presentation 15 years ago.
Well, I'm part of the team at Partners in Ministry, and what our aim is to help healthy pastors lead healthy churches. And so we're really wanting to make ourselves available to give this sort of presentation, show people the research. We're happy to do that. The other thing we do is work like I work with you as a coach or a pastoral supervisor, however we can to help pastors really lead healthy churches. That's what we want to do at Partners in Ministry. We're happy for people to contact us and follow us up.
Partners in Ministry, absolutely fantastic. It's been great, John. So thank you very much, John. Really appreciate it.